Well, you wanted this, so here we are, and this is the day where I go through my personal tier list of all of the enemies in Deep Rock Galactic. What's up guys, Jay here, and today we are finally gonna do the tier list of the ages. We've done biomes, perks, mission types, and weapons, but now it is time to do the one that people have been asking for the most, which is enemies. We're going to go through all of the enemies in the game. I have gathered all of them, at least I think I have all of them, but there are 62 different enemies here to go over, and we're going to touch on all of them. I was going through how I was going to rate these particular enemies, but I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go based off the fun factor, which is just how enjoyable they are to fight. The design, just if they are a cool design, if they have a cool concept to them, and primarily their difficulty, how annoying they are, and how just much of a pain they are to go through, which I guess could kind of be tied in with fun factor. So really in this particular tier list, the middle tree is actually probably going to be the best option, because then that kind of makes it the most balanced. But this is going to be a long one, so I'm going to have timestamps in the description below. That way, if you want to hear me talk about a specific bug, you don't have to listen to the entire thing and you can just jump to that particular section. And I just want to say that, again, like my other tier lists so far, this is purely just based off of my experience with a lot of these enemies. If you have a different feel about this, that is perfectly fine. Just because I put something somewhere does not mean that that's where it's supposed to be, and you are more than welcome to feel differently about this. But if you guys are ready, then let's dive into this big, massive tier list. Also, please be sure to like and subscribe, because this video took an insanely long time to make, and there were a lot of hiccups that had to delay it. So if you could please hit that like and subscribe button, it would be greatly appreciated. All right, back to the list. All right, so kicking it off, we're going to start very basic and very simple with the Glyphid Grunt. So the Glyphid Grunt, it's very, very standard. It is not really a whole lot to talk about in regards to the Glyphid Grunt. If you play literally any mission on any biome, anywhere, ever, you are going to fight mass amounts of these guys. There's nothing really too fancy about them. They don't have any crazy abilities or anything like that. They don't have any resistances. Their weakness is in their head, and they're pretty standard, and they're also relatively balanced. So I think we're just gonna put these guys directly in the middle, and I mean, actually now we'll put them more in the easy tier. I think easy is a little bit better because, again, there's nothing really too fancy about them, and they're just a basic standard unit in the game. So a good early start. Moving over immediately to their close cousin, the Glyphid Slashers. So these are a very mild mutation on the Glyphid Grunts. These ones are a little bit more, obviously, offensive based. They do more melee damage. Design-wise, I really like the look of them. I like the sort of spikiness of them, the sort of porcupine-y looking feel that they have. And again, these kind of are similar to the Grunts in where they're not really that big of an issue, and they're not really that oppressive, but they still are relatively enjoyable to fight. I would say these are, relatively balanced. I don't really have much trouble fighting these things when they show up, even if they show up in large numbers. That being said, I do know on higher hazard levels, these guys can really do a lot of damage to you, but because of the fact that they're, again, melee based, typically it's hard for them to get to you before they do any major issues. So I really don't have much of a problem with them, and the Slashers, gonna put in the balanced tier. Then we have the Glyphid Guards. This is another variation of the Glyphid Grunts, and they are basically the inverse to the Glyphid Slashers, where they are all about offense and doing more damage. The Guards are all about defenses. They have a lot more resistances, the resistance to ice, burning, all kinds of stuff. They're very tough. It's not really too tough to the point where they're an annoyance to fight, and I think that they still are not too bad because the armor isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world. I do think that they can be a little bit annoying sometimes, but still I wouldn't say that they're too bad. So I think we're still going to relatively put them in the balance tier, maybe a little bit higher than the Slashers though. Fighting the Guards is not really that big of an issue. It might take a couple more shots, and it might be a little bit more of an annoyance, but not enough to actually label it as an annoyance, if that makes any sense. So I think that the whole trifecta family of basic grunts is relatively easy or balanced to go up against. Next up is the Exploder. So these guys, I feel like are, some people might have varying different opinions on these guys, but I think these guys are relatively annoying for the simple reason that they are very stealthy. I don't know about you guys, but I pretty much never know when an Exploder is coming. And then by the time it gets to me, it already blows up. And if you're on a really high hazard level, it can essentially kill you if you have just one, two, or three of these things around you. So So they're a little bit more of an annoyance just because you can't really hear them coming. If they had some sort of very unique sound cue that lets you know that they were around, I think it would be a different story. But if these guys just unburrow themselves and then you just hear nothing, you're not really going to know that a bunch of exploders are around. Yes, they have the visually striking pustules on them that let you know that they are exploders. By the time you see them, sometimes they might already be right around you. So if there was some kind of a visual cue that something like the Stingtails have, where you can hear them before you see them, that way you at least know that there's an exploder nearby, that might put them a little bit lower, but they are a little bit of an annoyance, especially on the higher hazard levels. So that's where we're going to put the exploder for now. Next up, we have the Glyphid Menace. So these guys are the big guys who sort of appear randomly throughout certain missions, although personally I feel as though they spawn more on escort duty missions, but that's just me. And they're very large, they burrow into the ground, and then they pop up in other locations, and then they have a very powerful ranged attack. These guys are definitely, to me at least, a very big annoyance because they have a lot of range and they have a lot of health. You kind of need one or the other, and these guys just so happen to have both. And the fact that they can basically just go wherever they want when they tunnel away is also makes it very difficult for you to actually find them. So fighting these things can be a real pain in the butt sometimes. Depending on the situation, you might not even be able to fully put your attention towards fighting these things because you might have something else coming after you. So the fact that you have this thing jumping around, teleporting essentially to various locations and then bombarding you with ranged attacks, it can be pretty annoying. So that's why we're putting it in the annoyance tier. Then we have the Glyphid Warden. So the Warden is interesting. The Warden is basically a support bug. It doesn't really do any attacks of its own, I believe. I don't really think it has too many attacks as far as I can tell. But the main thing that the Warden does is it heals and buffs nearby bugs that are around it. So if you want to take out the bugs that are surrounding the Warden, you should definitely take out the Warden first. I would say the Warden is honestly relatively easy. I know it has more health than the average bug, and in some cases it can be a little bit annoying to take out because of the fact that it doesn't do any damage in and of itself, and the fact that you can very easily tell where the Warden is because all of the bugs that are getting healed by it have this like purple energy beam going towards the Warden, so you know exactly where the Warden is. You can sort of just dump a grenade launcher shot or just some of your high-powered shots in there, and the weak point is very easily accessible. It's the big, bright pink bulb that it has on top. It can be taken out relatively easily, and then the rest of the swarm kind of dissipates after that. So I don't really personally think the Warden is that bad. I know some people might think that it's a lot harder, but in my experience, the Warden has never been anything where it's like, oh no, we have a Warden going on. It's more of a case of, okay, there's a Warden there. We have to take that out before we can take out anything else. And then we can take it out relatively quickly. It can be, okay, you know what? Now that I think about it, maybe heading up a little bit towards the balanced tier because while it itself is easy, makes up for the fact that it is easy to kill and counter by the fact that everything else around it is not as easy to kill or counter. So I guess that kind of makes a little bit more sense. So Glyphid Warden going in the balanced tier. Next up, we have the spitters, the acid spitters. So this is where we are probably going to have some very conflicting ideas for depending on certain people. But personally, I am not fond of fighting the spitters, especially on the higher hazard levels, just because they are snipers, essentially. They have pinpoint aim, they have a ridiculous amount of range, and the shots hit really hard, especially on the higher difficulty levels. These guys can basically just be tucked away in a corner. You won't even really know they're there. And then all of a sudden you just get bombarded with spitter shots and then you're down before you can even do anything about it. So I think what's important to take away from the spitters is that they can be a real pain because they just have a lot of range. And that is the biggest issue with them, is the fact that they are so numerous and they do a lot of damage for the caliber of enemy that they are. They're meant to be like a very basic enemy that comes at you very often, and yet they hit in some cases even harder than menaces, I feel like. So that's why we're putting the spitter in the pain category. It's not abruptly like I look at that and I think, oh god, no, but it is a pain in the butt to get rid of, and that's why we're putting it there. Then we have the Glyphid Web Spitter. So these are kind of like a weird variation of the acid spitter, to where instead of shooting acid, they shoot webs. Immediately, they're not nearly as bad because they don't do as much damage. However, they do immobilize you or slow you down significantly. in some cases can be even worse than doing damage. So putting this one is going to be kind of a difficult situation to say. In my personal experience, I don't think the Web Spitter is as bad as the Acid Spitter. It is still a big annoyance, the fact that these things can basically just immobilize you for an undisclosed period of time. But the fact that it doesn't outright kill you, and the fact that there are only certain situations where this could be lethal if you are in a bad situation, whereas the Acid Spitter, any situation can be lethal because it itself is probably going to kill you. So that's probably the reason why I would put the Web Spitter where it is. Not the most painful thing to go up against, but also something that I really just despise going up against as well. So now we have the Glyphid Swarmers. So these guys are the little tiny ones that come out of the walls or just show up randomly or just happen to pop up in swarms whenever. They're very, very tiny. They are very easy to kill, but they obviously swarm the crap out of you, and there's a ton of them that will generally come after you. These guys are kind of hard to place. In terms of overall difficulty, they themselves are not that hard. I would say that they are easy, but if we're not going based off of that, the thing that makes these guys so annoying is when they swarm together, and especially if you're on high hazard levels, these guys can still do a good amount of damage, even if it's not by themselves. When you get hit by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 bites back to back to back, you could very easily go down from that. And that's very, very scary. And the fact that these guys usually have like 9, 10, 12, 13 in a swarm when they come after you, it can be a little bit annoying sometimes. Because of that, we're probably going to put them in the annoyance factor, just because the fact that they do an insane amount of damage when coupled in a group like that, especially on the high hazard levels, and they are insanely fast, can just be a real annoyance to take care of, because you could be dealing with things like slashers or guards or even menaces and not really be able to focus on the tiny little guys that are around you. These guys here are the reason why I run thorns on 90% of the builds that I run, unless I need passive perks for something specific. These guys right here, and a couple other enemies, which we'll get to later, are the main reason why I primarily run thorns on most of my builds. That's one thing to keep in mind, is that they are essentially hard countered by thorns, but you still take the damage when they hit you, so kind of a give and trade, but definitely I would say an annoyance. Then after that, we have the Glyphid Spawns, which are very similar to the Glyphid Swarmers in the sense that they are essentially the same size, the same overall caliber. However, they have less health. And that's really the only main difference that I can surmise. The only thing about them is that they come specifically from the Brood Nexus, which we'll get to next. So these guys can only show up from the Brood Nexus. So I would say they're a little bit easier. They're still annoying because of just the fact that, again, so many of them show up. They have such high numbers in them when they come out that it can be similar to the Swarmers. The positive thing is that they don't have as much health, so they're even easier to kill than normal. But easier to kill but still being one shot it puts them essentially at the same place as the Swarmers. So that's kind of why I'm putting them there, because they're essentially the same unit. And then on that note, we are going to the Glyphid Brood Nexus. So the Brood Nexus is what creates the said Glyphid Swarmers. Now the thing about the Brood Nexus is it's stationary, so you don't really need to worry about it going anywhere, so you know exactly where it is. It has a lot of health, but it's also not super duper durable, and it doesn't really have any attacks other than the fact that when it dies, it spawns swarmers. So I would say this is a relatively easy thing to take out. The only real thing about it is just the fact that the Brood Nexus creates Glyphid spawns, and that's really the only thing that it has going for it. But outside of that, just attacking it by itself, pretty easy to take out. It has a lot of health, but it has like no real resistances or weaknesses or anything like that. So just dump a clip into it and you should be able to take it out relatively easily. So now we are getting into the bigger and badder enemies to a certain degree. We have the Glyphid Praetorian, everybody's favorite jolly green giant that loves to trounce about the caves and make our lives relatively difficult. The Praetorian, I think, is not really too bad of a tough enemy. It's durable, but it has very strong ways to take it out. Obviously, its weak point is in its back, and also if you hit it at its head, it can stun it very well. It's a good balance of strong, but also has weaknesses, which I think is going to put it probably in the balanced tier. I know this can vary depending on like the types of variations of the Praetorians, like Frost Praetorians or the Radioactive Praetorians. But for the most part, I don't really see the Praetorians as that big of an obstacle. They're obviously more difficult than, say, these three, because it's just naturally a bigger enemy, it's a bigger caliber enemy to fight. But that being said, it is still relatively simple to take out. Understanding what it means to take out a Praetorian is not that hard, and just committing a little bit of ammo and time to it will take it out relatively easily. And the design factor, again, it's very, very cool. But then again, I'm a sucker for green because green's my favorite color, but that's besides the point. Overall, the Praetorian, not too bad. Good, big, beefy unit, and not really too much of an annoyance or too easy. Now, the next unit, I don't know if I can necessarily say the same thing about, because now we have the Oppressor. The Oppressor is probably the raw, most powerful non-boss specific bug that you can go up against, or non-boss specific enemy that you can go up against, because it is just very, very durable. Unlike the Praetorian and unlike most of the other bugs that we have talked about so far, this thing cannot be damaged unless you hit it directly in its weak point, unless you do a power attack with your pickaxe. That's the only real way you can damage it outside of just hitting its weak point. And its weak point is only on its back. If you hit it anywhere else with any sort of, unless you have some kind of elemental damage like flamethrower, the cryo cannon, or anything like that, but direct bullet damage can only hit it if it hits it in its weak point. Other than that, you're just going to bounce off its deflective armor. Personally, I think this thing is a relatively big annoyance. It's not the worst thing in the world to fight, and it is very strong and intimidating, and I do like that aspect about it. However, the fact that your window to hit this thing is only a very small part on its back, and it's very strong. It's very slow, which does help with that a lot, but it has a lot of wide AoE attacks, and it's just so intimidating that sometimes you don't have the ability to get behind it very quickly because, again, you have other things you have to worry about. So do I think it's the hardest thing in the world? No. Is it a pain in the butt to fight? No. Is it a big annoyance? Yes. In fact, I'm probably going to put this a little bit higher on the annoyance tier. And that, I would say, is an accurate summary of the Oppressor. Every time one of these things shows up, I'm always not scared, but at the very least intimidated, because I know I'm going to be spending a good amount of time taking this thing out. So now we are going on to the family of Dreadnoughts, starting off with the basic Dreadnought, the simplest bog standard Dreadnought that you get in your elimination missions. So this one is, I would say, it's in my opinion the simplest of all three, obviously, because it's not a variation, it's not a evolution or anything like that based off of the other Dreadnoughts. And it's relatively balanced in terms of how Dreadnoughts work. The way this thing works, if you don't know, is it just has an armor plating on its back, on its butt area that you break. And then once you break it, then you hit said butt area, and that is its weak point, and that deals damage to it. And eventually, once you deal enough damage or enough time passes, the armor will grow back, and then you just have to lather and repeat. It's annoying in the sense that you don't have constant damage that's being put up on this thing because you have to keep breaking the armor, which is not a bad thing. It's the simplest to take out of the three Dreadnoughts, and there's no external factor that you have to worry about that you have to keep track of. Its attacks are strong, but relatively easy to telegraph and avoid. And other than that, it's just a very simple Dreadnought to fight. So I would say this is relatively balanced to fight. It can be a little bit of an annoyance in later hazard levels and things like that. But overall, in terms of the Dreadnoughts, this is the one where whenever this pops out of the egg, I'm like, oh, okay, cool. Just a normal Dreadnought, simple, not really much to worry about. The next one, on the other hand, the Hive-guard, is, in my opinion, a colossal pain in the butt to fight. And I've said this several times on stream and on the channel and all that kind of stuff. The Hive-guard is my least favorite of the Dreadnoughts to go up against, just because I don't like the number of steps that you have to go through in order to actually get this thing to go down. The fact that, A, you have to take out its goons, which they're not that difficult in and of itself other than the puddles of stuff that they leave behind. But the fact that you have to go through that and then you have to hit its weak points, which are a lot smaller and harder to hit than the other weak points. It may not seem that way, especially if you're somebody who runs more heavy explosive stuff, but the fact that the weak points are a lot smaller, and then after that, then you can hit the weak point, which still has a bit of a smaller hitbox than the other Dreadnought, or pretty much even the Praetorian almost. All the while you're doing that, it's doing these very, very heavy, powerful AoE moves, which on high hazard levels can just wipe the entire team if you're not careful. All of those things together make the Hive-guard, to me, just a very time-consuming and taxing thing to take care of. And that's assuming that everything goes well, because if you get like strange glitches or problems where for some reason one of the sentinels doesn't spawn or doesn't go after the proper person, or the Hive-guard just does not register that it's at that particular stage of the fight and it doesn't spawn the sentinels, it could just take a very long period of time. And I haven't had that sort of thing happen with the other dreadnoughts. So ultimately that puts the Hive-guard in the pain category, because it's so many steps with not, to me, a very rewarding sense of accomplishment. And then the last dreadnought, or I guess set of dreadnoughts, is the twins, the Arbalest and the Lacerator. So these guys are, I would say, they're not as bad as the Hive-guard, but I would also say that they're worse than the dreadnought. So the thing with these two is you have to damage them relatively in the same amount of time or at the same rate, because the thing is, if one of them gets too weak, they will then do this animation where they share health and their health will equalize between the two of them. It happens multiple times. I believe it's guaranteed to happen at least once, no matter what happens, regardless of the difference. It can make the fight drag out a lot. So the problem with these ones is you have to plan the fight and make sure that you're damaging the right dreadnought at the right time. That way you don't have too many healing phases, because then it just drags out the entire fight. So while not being nearly as bad as the Hive-guard, at least in my personal opinion, I do think that it is still relatively high of an annoyance factor. The fact that you have to keep track of, oh no, I hit the Lacerator. I got to stop hitting the Lacerator too much. I got to go back and hit the Arbalest. But the Arbalest might not be close to you. It might be attacking your ally or whatever the case may be. You might not be able to get to it in time. Also, if you don't have good communication with your teammates, if you're playing with randoms or something like that, they might just try to delete one of the dreadnoughts right away, and then they don't realize that the healing is going to happen, and then the fight just drags out longer than it has to be. So I would say it's still an annoyance. It's still kind of difficult to go up against, but it's nowhere near as much of a pain as the Hive-guard, for example. So the twins, I would say, are an annoyance, but not quite a pain. So next we have a set of creatures that are a little bit more specific, so it's kind of hard to really put them in a category, because the next set of creatures only comes when you perform a machine event. So right now we have the Ebonite Grunt and the Ebonite Praetorian. So I feel like these guys, it's almost kind of to be put in the irrelevant category, only because they only show up in the machine events. They're pretty easy to take out because the machine event literally gives you the means to take them out in 1 or 2 hits, maybe 3, depending on if you're going up against a Praetorian or a Grunt. Ultimately, it's kind of weird to rank these guys, just because, again, they're so specific and they only show up in very short periods of time. So I think it's relatively safe to say that they're kind of irrelevant, just because they're in such a specific set of circumstances that you're not going to go up against these guys all the time. You can choose whether or not you even want to go up against them if you don't feel like doing the machine event at that particular time. And even if you do, fighting them is still not really that difficult, because you just get the power-ups and just smack them to death. And along those same lines, we have the Kursite enemies, the Kursite Grunt, Kursite Praetorian, and Kursite Mactera. So Kursite is, again, another machine event. It's the Kursite Infection machine event. And ultimately, I would say, again, these guys are probably relatively irrelevant, just because they function essentially the exact same as the normal enemies. I don't believe there's any real different health scalings or anything like that. I believe they essentially have the exact same health and characteristics of the other enemies. So it's kind of hard to really say that they're even a different enemy category entirely, because they're just the same bugs, just with yellow crystals sticking out of them. I think their pathing might be slightly different, but ultimately, if you've gone up against a Grunt, you've gone up against a Kursite Grunt. If you've gone up against a Praetorian, you've gone up against a Kursite Praetorian. So I would say these guys are relatively irrelevant, just because of the fact that, again, you only fight them in a vacuum. Moving on to the next one, we have everybody's favorite friend, the Bulk Detonator. These guys have a very low chance to spawn, and they are essentially gigantic nuclear bombs in bug form. When you kill them and defeat them, they will do this massive explosion, which does a lot of damage and creates a humongous crater. I am putting these guys in the oh god no category, and there's really one specific reason for this, and that's because, at least in my experience, I always get a bulk detonator in the most inconvenient times. in the most inconvenient of situations where I do not want to bulk detonator. I'm on an escort duty and Doretta is stuck in one spot and we can't kill it before it gets close to her, so she takes a bunch of damage. Really, just any unhelpful situation for a detonator to spawn in, I have had it spawn in. And that is what makes these guys such a pain and what makes me so unhappy to go up against them. Now, granted, fighting them is not really that hard. They're really not that difficult of an enemy to take out. You have to just focus on the glowing parts on them, but they still have a lot of health, so even with that, it can still take a while to go after them. And characters who want to be relatively close range, like the driller or the gunner or the engineer in certain situations, they can't really stay close to him because if they do, he's gonna take them with him when he goes. And even the initial explosion, he also sends out like shrapnel that will explode when it hits the ground. So even if you're not directly close to them, you can still get caught in the explosion even when you're not needed to. So that's why I'm putting it there, just because I have always had bad experiences with bulk detonators. And on that same line, we have the bulk Crassus-Detonator. Now this is something a little bit different. I'm obviously not going to put it quite as high, for one reason and one reason only, and that's because of gold. If you don't know, the Crassus-Detonator is the exact same as the bulk detonator, with the exception of when it explodes and dies, the explosion that it leaves behind, the crater that it leaves behind when it blows up, is laced entirely with gold. So you can get absolutely bonkers rich when these things show up. They're still a pain to take out because they still follow the same rules as the bulk detonators, but the reason why I'm not putting it in Oh God No is because I, of course, like it when these guys spawn because it just means I get a humongous payout. Ultimately, if it wasn't for the gold, I would probably be in the same exact category, but because of the fact that these things at least pretty much pay for themselves, the only problem I have with these things is when they do show up, it just means that we are also going to be spending the next 25 to 30 minutes just mining out all the gold, especially if you don't have a driller to help you out in the process. So that's kind of one of the biggest pains with these things is when they blow up and leave all the gold everywhere, you have to spend like a half hour just to collect it. So that can be the biggest problem. But other than that, still a pain in the butt to take out, but it comes with its own reward. So next, we have the Cave Leech, and similar to the bulk detonator, we are putting this in the Oh God No category because when you least expect a leech to be there, it is always there and it will always get you. These things can just snatch you from what feels like an infinite range. I've had these things get me from what feels like several miles in the air. It's never in a good situation. The fact that if you're playing by yourself and you don't have heightened senses, you can kind of just be screwed because if you have Bosco, yes, he can get you out, but he can sometimes take his time to the point where if you're playing on a high hazard level, you could just be dead anyway. And if you're playing with randoms, they might not know exactly where you are, or they might not be able to get you in time, so you're just going to end up going down. And even if you have teammates that you can communicate with and that you can talk to, it might still take them a while to get to you. And all that time you're just sitting there helpless and defenseless. And it's just pain. It's just misery. It's just hard. It's just horrendousness, especially if you have cave leech clusters where you have several of these like all together and they all try to come after you. It is just, these things are the reason why I run heightened senses a lot. It's just because I hate getting randomly grabbed by them. Ultimately though, they're not the hardest things in the world to kill. They take only a couple shots, but the problem with them, at least in my opinion, is just the absolute fear factor that they have. Just you're sitting there dealing with a swarm, trying to get an objective done or whatever the case may be, and then all of a sudden you just get snatched up and get pulled into the ceiling, and then you're just kind of at the mercy of the cave leech at that point. So that's kind of why I don't like getting scared when I play this game, and these things scare the crap out of me every time. So that's why we're putting it there. Again, it's probably not the hardest thing in the world to kill or really to avoid, but it's just that surprise factor is just, oh god, it's so bad. Now we have the Carnivorous Larva. So this is again another unit that is kind of hard to talk about because it only shows up in very specific circumstances. This unit only shows up if you are on a mission that has Parasites Mutator, where the bugs are infected with a parasite, and when you kill them, these Carnivorous Larva spawn out of them, and they will hop around for a little bit because they will die slowly after not having a host, so they will either kill themselves or they'll jump at you to try to do an attack, which will also cause them to die, or if pretty much any bullet whizzes past them, it'll kill them. So these things are pretty easy to take out, and they don't really do anything. They don't apply any sort of status effect or anything like that. They just sort of jump at you and do damage, and if they hit you, then you take a little bit of damage. and then they die. And if they don't hit you, then they die. So these guys are relatively easy and also like close to irrelevant because again, you're only going to be finding them in certain situations. You're only going to be finding them with a specific mutator on. So they're pretty easy to take out and not really too terrifying. They are creepy though. I will say these are one of the creepiest enemies to go up against. I don't like slug-like things or, you know, larva type things or anything like that, or anything that jumps at you. So now we are moving over to the Mactera family of enemies, starting off with the Mactera Spawn, the very basic, very standard Mactera enemy. It is relatively weak. It's not that dangerous. It will fly after you. It will attack you. It's not really that bad. And its weak point is its abdomen, and it is extremely weak in that area. So if you hit that very easily, it'll go down. I would say that the Mactera Spawn are relatively easy to take out. They're not the most dangerous thing in the world. They won't really give you as much pressure as some of the other Mactera breeds, which we'll talk about later. And ultimately, they are just the standard of default, similar to how the Grunt is with the Grunt family of units. It's standard, it's basic, and it's not going to be too oppressive. It's just kind of just a gateway to the other Mactera breeds that we are going to be talking about. Which, moving over to that, we have the Mactera Brundle. Now, the Brundle is interesting. The Brundle is basically just a more heavily armored, heavily more aggressive version of the Spawn. It has a little bit more plating, it has a little bit more damage, and it's basically like an upgraded version of the Spawn, kind of similar to the Slasher of the Grunts. So similarly to that, I would say it's relatively balanced. It's not really that big of a deal to go up against. Not really annoying, not really easy because it has that little bit of extra plating on it. And ultimately, it's not the worst thing in the world to go up against. Mactera family has a lot of different bugs, and I think the Brundle and the Spawn are probably the two ones that I don't really worry about the most at all, just because they are pretty straightforward. They have standard attacks. The Brundle is just a little bit more durable, a little bit more tanky, and a little bit more aggressive. So not really too much to say about that one. Then we have the Mactera Goo-Bomber. So the Goo-Bomber is interesting, and I feel like a lot of people are going to have different things to say about the Goo-Bomber specifically. But the Goo-Bomber is interesting to say the least. So the way that this one works is it sort of flies around, it shoots out goo globs, and it has these two gigantic weak points on them that are basically two of its goo sacks, I guess is the best way to describe it. And if you break one and pop it, it A, does a whole lot of damage, and B, spreads goo around like a super soaker, and it covers the whole area with goo. It makes it hard to move, it does damage, and it's just overall annoying. And even when you kill the Goo-Bomber, it will fly around and it's like a death flying type thing, and it will just start spraying goo everywhere until it crashes and dies. So these things can honestly be a relatively decent annoyance, just because it's almost inevitable that they're going to spread a good amount of goo and you will have a hard time moving around. That being said, it's not a humongous pain to go up against, but it can still be relatively annoying to go through. So the Goo-Bomber, there's not a whole lot to say about it other than just the fact that it makes goo, and that makes it walking around very, very annoying, very difficult. And its attack patterns, it doesn't really have that much attacks other than shooting goo at you, which on high hazard levels, yes, all of this can be very, very dangerous. And on high hazard levels, this can absolutely decimate a team because you're all just caught out of position, essentially. So then we have the Mactera Tri-jaw. Now the Tri-jaw is a little bit different than the Spawn and the Brundle in the sense that it has a much bigger focus on range attacks to it. Similar to the Glyphid Acid Spitters, these things will hang back and try actually shooting at you instead of how the Spawn and Brundles will rush in for the attack. The Tri-jaws are a little bit, in my experience, not quite as hard to kill as some of the other enemy types, such as the Brundles and also the Goo-Bomber. The fact that they have range and similar to the Spitters, they have really good accuracy and really good damage, it can be very oppressive, especially on the higher hazard levels. So I think with that, we're going to put this probably similar to, I don't think they're quite as an annoyance as the Spitter because they're bigger and easier to see, and because of the fact that they will try to fly close to you, it's not nearly as bad as the Spitters in terms of finding them, because the Tri-jaws are going to make themselves known to you very easily. So we'll probably put it somewhere around this area here. They're a mild annoyance. They're kind of tough, but they're not. It's not something that I hate going up against. The Tri-jaws are not really that bad. Similar to the other Mactera enemies, which I didn't mention, is the fact that if you freeze them, they just die instantly. So now we have everybody's favorite snatcher, the Mactera Grabber. So the Grabber is interesting. He doesn't really do any attacks. He just grabs you and takes you away from the team, and he might drop you in a very precarious situation. So it's very similar to the Cave Leech, but I still would say it's not quite as much. I'd say it's a pain, because if you're not prepared and your teammates get caught out of position, they will just get separated and get dropped into a swarm or dropped into a deep hole or something, and then the team is separated. Things go badly. So this can be a real pain to deal with. But to me, it doesn't have that like inherent, oh God, no factor that some of the other ones have, mainly because you can hear this one coming. It makes a very distinctive sound cue whenever it is trying to grab somebody. And because of that, you're able to sort of plan for it and be able to be like, oh, okay, there's a grabber nearby. Everyone watch out, be careful, look in the skies. And then you can sort of adjust that way. With Cave Leeches, you don't have the opportunity to do that. That thing is just going to grab you, it is going to hit you, it is going to hurt you, and you are going to not see it coming. The Grabber has the, I guess, politeness to announce its presence, to say, hey, I'm trying to grab you. So that is pretty much all there is to say about the Grabber. It doesn't really do any attacks. It's more of a displacement enemy type than a damaging enemy type. So moving on to the next one, and I kind of have them a little bit out of order here, but we'll go here. We'll start with the Naedocyte Breeder. So this is a big flying enemy that doesn't necessarily, similar to the Grabber, doesn't really have any attacks of its own. Its attacks are actually spawning creatures. In terms of difficulty, the Naedocyte Breeder is actually relatively easy to take out. And the reason I say that is because it doesn't really do much of anything by itself. It just spawns or creates the Naedocyte Swarmers, or sorry, Naedocyte Hatchlings, I should say. And these things are really what do all of the damage, what do all of the attackings. They're similar to the Swarmers in that they are very weak. They don't have a whole lot of base health, and their overall attack damage is very low. But the fact that there's a lot of them means they can swarm you, they can get you outnumbered, they can attack you very easily. And that is where the annoyance factor of the Naedocyte Breeder comes into play. The Breeder itself is not that bad, really. In fact, I would even say it's more or less balanced, just because while it is big and it has a lot of health and it does fly, it itself doesn't really do much of anything outside of just creating the hatchlings. The hatchlings, on the other hand, are truly annoying. They definitely do have a lot more of an annoyance factor, because if you don't take out the Naedocyte Breeder, they're just going to keep coming after you, and you're going to have just a bad time. Overall, though, I would say the relationship between the Breeder and the hatchlings to be not really that bad. The Breeder is not too difficult to take care of, and the hatchlings, while also not being too difficult to take care of, they can swarm you, they fly, they're very fast, and they can be very annoying. Not nearly annoying, however, as our next unit, which is the Naedocyte Shockers. And these guys I am putting directly in the oh god no category, because I hate going up against these guys. These guys are probably one of my least favorite unit types in the entire game, just because I hate the fact that they can literally just spawn out of nowhere in mass amounts of numbers, just swarm directly to you. And if you don't have thorns, you're basically just at the mercy of these things. Or if you don't have some kind of high AoE weapons, or are able to basically predict that they're coming out, you're just at the mercy of these things getting shocked left and right. And in many cases, I cannot tell you how many times I have been doing good on a particular mission, and then out of nowhere, a bunch of Naedocyte Shockers just decide to spawn, electrocute me to death, and then I go down. And then there's not much I can do about that. Like, the fact that they are weak and they don't take a whole lot of damage to take out is a very redeeming factor. However, the fact that they could just pop out of nowhere, they don't even need to be spawn from a Naedocyte Breeder. They can just spawn anywhere. The fact that they are very fast, the fact that they can swarm you very easily, it just makes them such an annoyance to go up against. And to me, I hate every time I hear that whoosh of like 12 or 13 of them spawning at once. And it's just, I can't stand going up against these things. I'm sure they're not nearly as bad as like in some other people's tier list, but for me personally, it's just, I can't stand going up against them. So next up, we have the Coronar family of enemies. First up, we have the Coronar Youngling. Now, these guys I think can only spawn on certain biomes. These guys specifically can only show up on the salt pits. So that is one thing about them, is you don't really have to worry about them too much outside of one particular biome. And in terms of the two Coronar enemies, these guys are not really that bad. They turn into a little ball, sort of Metroid style, and just will roll around and come at you. These ones can't really do a whole lot to you. They will unfold and then they will just try to attack you. Ultimately, the younglings specifically are, in my opinion, not too bad. Don't really have a whole lot of pressure, at least in my experiences, not nearly as much as compared to the regular shellbacks, which we'll get to that later. And ultimately, they're not that much oppressive of a force because they're not big enough to be able to displace you nearly as much shellback is, and they just don't have quite as much damage or resistances to warrant being annoying to take out. So overall, the younglings are not that difficult, and I would say that if you come across these things, just keep your distance and take a couple of shots and you'll pick them out relatively easily. I do like the design of them though. I do like the design of them and the shellback, which I'll talk more about that with the shellback, but I do like the design of these particular enemies. Then moving over to the shellback, the shellback, I believe, also only has a couple of spawns. So the shellback actually can spawn anywhere except for the salt pits and sandblasted corridors, which is interesting. So it can spawn in any biome except for those two, which I'm not quite sure exactly why they have it set that way. But in any event, the shellback is definitely more oppressive and more annoying than the youngling. Mainly, in fact, I would say these things are very much a pain to take out because these guys, similar to the grabbers and the cave leeches, they can displace you very easily. Like these things were the stingtails before stingtails were a thing. They would roll into you and they would just knock you thousands of feet back, and they would knock you into a wall, knock you off a cliff, or just knock you out of position. And you were just so thrown off. You were like, where am I? What's happening? They can hit very hard if they roll into you, especially on high hazard levels. I'm glad that they are banned in 2 of the biomes, but they also don't show up a whole often. I guess that's also a decent balancing factor, is that they don't really show up that often. And when I do see them, most of the team knows, okay, let's focus on that shellback anyway. In that sense, I guess maybe I'll lower it a little bit. It's not quite as big of a deal because, again, they don't show up very often. But when they do, they are certainly an annoyance. Then we are going to the Nayaka Trawler. This is specific to the sandblasted corridor, which kind of makes it a little bit more niche because you're only going to be seeing it in a specific biome. And it doesn't really have many attacks. It just kind of does something similar to what the shellback does, where it kind of just runs into you, displaces you, and pushes you away. So with that in mind, I think I'm going to probably put that more in the easier tier, maybe even irrelevant, just because it only shows up on one biome. And when you do, it's pretty easy to take out because it doesn't have any resistances, doesn't really have any weaknesses, I don't think. I believe it has a weak spot, but I can't remember off the top of my head where it is. And although it's fast, it's still relatively easy to take out, and you won't be dealing with it too often. That's kind of where we're going to be putting the Nayaka Trawler. If you're in the sandblasted corridors, it can be a mild annoyance, but if you're anywhere else, you literally don't have to worry about it. Now we have our stationary threat with the Spitball Infector. So this is basically like a Glyphid sentry gun, except turned up to 11. This thing will shoot massive balls of like radioactive poisonous fire that do very high amounts of damage. And this thing is a mega pain to deal with. In fact, I think we're going to probably put that just about there. This thing is a real issue to deal with because although it is stationary and although it is not the most healthy thing in the world, the amount of damage that this thing can throw out, especially at high hazard levels, is just insane. And the fact that it is very hard to tell that it's there until it decides to make itself known means it's almost guaranteed to get 1 if not 2 shots off, which can be more than enough to take somebody down. So the fact that the Spitballer can essentially almost always get at least 1 free shot off, and that shot is pretty much lethal, this thing is oppressive, is very, very dangerous to take care of. The fact that it's stationary is kind of the only thing that really helps solidify it a lot more, but ultimately these things are a pain to take out, especially since you pretty much never deal with just 1 at a time. There's always like 3 or maybe even 4, depending on how bad the situation you're in, just hanging around, and you just have to take them all out before you can really go anywhere or do anything. So that's where we're putting the Spitballer for right now. It is a pain, but the fact that it is stationary does mean you can hide behind cover. So that's kind of the one silver lining it has. So next up, I'm actually going to adjust the order very so slightly because I feel like this is a little bit more appropriate, but we have the Stabber Vine. Stabber Vine is something that is specific to the hollow bough biome. These are the sort of vine-like things that have the claws at the end of it that they will extend out and stab you, hurt you a lot, and in some cases even send you flying. These things are a big annoyance. They are really, really annoying. However, they also are only in one biome. So I would say for the most part that these guys are actually relatively easy to take out just because, again, you don't really need to worry about them unless you're in the hollow bough biome. And if you are in that biome, then you know to be on the lookout for these things and you know to look for them, you know to be alert for them. And when you see them, you have to just play very carefully and stay out of the way and then take them out once they try to hit you. It's very easy to sidestep and avoid the hit or go around some cover. So while it is really annoying on the hollow bough biome, the fact that it only exists on that biome kind of helps offset it a lot. And the fact that even on that biome, it can be annoying, but also not super, super bad. It's really not that difficult to take care of. So now we have reached the pair that I'm sure a lot of people are curious about. First, we have the Stingtail. So the Stingtail is a unit that has had a lot of discussion about it over the past several months. And I'm sure that everybody is in agreement that the Stingtail is a little bit too overtuned at this particular point in time. It has a lot of armor that makes it difficult to take out. It has a ton of range to where it can grab you. It is very fast. It is very quick to grab you. And this thing, similar to the Shellback, can just pull you out of a position so badly to where you essentially just die. That being said, I do think that the Stingtail has a couple things that help sort of pull it back from that insanely high oppressive nature. One being the fact that it has several audio cues that let you know when it's A, around, and B, about to do its attack. Once you do break its armor, it's not really the hardest thing in the world to take out. It's relatively squishy. And also the fact that the grab, although it being really annoying, is something that is also dodgeable, although it is hard to kind of practice, and especially if you're not used to it, you can dodge the grab, which can come into play depending on the situation that you're in. The only problem is that those situations are usually few and far between because the Stingtails usually come in groups and will join massive swarms, so you typically have other things that you have to worry about. So all of that said, I will say the Stingtail is definitely a pain to go up against, but it is not the most oppressive thing in the entire game right now. I would still rather go up against a Stingtail than well, actually I should probably put the Stingtail above the Acid Spitter because they both kind of function the same way. I'd still rather go up against a Stingtail than any of the other Dreadnoughts, if that makes any sense. And then on the other side of that, we have the other new unit that was added with Season 4, which is the Glyphid Septic Spreader. So the Septic Spreader is kind of similar to the Spitter in the sense that it has a ranged attack, except for instead of the Spitter being more like a sniper rifle, the Septic Spreader is more like a grenade launcher. It spits out and hurls massive globs of, I really don't want to think about what the material is, considering the fact that it's called a Septic Spreader, probably throwing its own materials at us, but I could be wrong. That being said, the Septic Spreader is not nearly as oppressive as the Stingtail or the Spitter, at least in my personal opinion, for a couple of reasons. Number one is similar to the Stingtail, it does have some audio cues that let you know when it's around. It has like a specific kind of hiss sound effect that only it makes that allow you to know that it's around. It's also very visually striking. It glows red, so you know when it's around when you're looking at it. And also the projectiles, while are bigger and while can do a lot of damage, the fact that they move slower and are able to basically be dodged out of the way does help you a lot in terms of being able to sort of avoid this thing or take it out before it even attacks. So ultimately, I would say the Septic Spreader is on the high end of balance, getting close to annoyance just because the amount of damage that the sludge can do on high hazard levels can be very, very high. But again, the fact that it doesn't show up, at least in my experience, as often as the Stingtails, and the fact that, again, it's pretty easy to tell when a Septic Spreader is around, kind of helps to sort of lower it down a little bit. So that's where we're going to put that for right now. Now we are going to the rival tech enemies. So this is going to be another setup of enemies where I feel as though a lot of people are going to have different varying things to say. So first things first, we'll start with the simplest one, which is the rival shredder. These are the little tiny drones that come around, they fly around, they run into you, they have like a drill attack that they hit you with. They're not the worst thing in the world to deal with. They're kind of the rival tech equivalent of the swarmers. or the Naedocyte Hatchlings. And ultimately, while they are annoying, are not quite as annoying as some of the other ones just because they don't have as many that show up. And they don't show up as often, at least in my personal experience. However, I will say they are still annoying, so we'll probably just link that with the rest of the tiny swarmer type enemies with the annoyance factor. So that's why we're kind of putting it right there. Then we have the sniper turrets. The sniper turrets will show up in industrial sabotage missions around the power stations that you have to hack into, and will typically be on the ceilings. The caretaker might spit some out, or if you just have a rival presence mutator on your mission, you might see sniper turrets. These ones, they do a lot of damage and they obviously have a very long range, but they have the tell that they are looking at you by this big laser beam that's pointing at you, so you know that one is about to shoot at you. Also, they are stationary, similar to some of the other turrets that we're going to go through, so they are relatively easy to take out. And what's more is if you fully set them on fire, so if you have a driller with you, these things are pretty easy to take out. That being said, they do a lot of damage, and they can hit you from very far away, so you being able to hit them might not be the easiest thing in the world. So that being said, I would say that they're similar to the Septic Spreader, balanced but encroaching on the annoyance factor just because they have such long range. It can be annoying if the circumstances are wrong, but because of the fact that they're relatively weak and immobile, you can work your way around them relatively easily. And then we have the burst turrets. So these are kind of like the more standard issue turrets that you will go up against. They fire in a several shot burst. They have medium-ish range. They're not nearly as long range as the sniper turrets, and the shots are a lot more dodgeable because they have a bit of travel time to them. These guys, I would say, are relatively balanced. I don't really see too much of a problem going up against them. Similar to the other turrets, they die relatively easily. They're stationary, so you know exactly where they're going to be. And ultimately, yeah, they're not the hardest thing in the world to take care of. So then we have the rival repulsion turret. So these are the ones that spit out those sort of barrier squares that typically are meant to protect other turrets. You'll essentially see these things lined up with other turrets like pulse turrets or even sniper turrets. And they are mainly there for defense and for also slowing you down because the shields can push you back. These are probably the most annoying out of all the turrets to take care of. And ultimately, while I do still think that they're not the hardest thing to take care of, I do think that they are encroaching on the more annoyance factor of things because they fulfill a function similar to, say, the Warden for the Glyphids. However, the difference being is that the Warden doesn't do anything that oppresses the player. Like, the healing doesn't necessarily oppress the player. It makes the bug stronger, which might oppress the players, but it itself doesn't do anything that stops the players from doing anything. The repulsion turret does, because the barricades stop you from shooting. They stop you from moving in certain cases, which can kind of be a little bit annoying to deal with at times. And I am going to take a short break before I continue the next one. All right, sorry about that. And I also moved the camera a little bit because it looks like we're going to have more annoyance things than I thought we were going to. So next up, we have the rival patrol bots. So these are the standard mobile unit that the rival tech characters have. And these things are not the worst things in the world to take care of. They have a relatively easy to hit weak spot. The damage they do isn't crazy. Their resistances are manageable. Again, fire is really good against these guys. And the fact that after you beat these things, there is a chance that you can get one on your side by hacking into it is always very useful. So ultimately, I would say that the patrol bots are not really too bad. Maybe you're like around here-ish is where I'm going to put them. I'm actually going to move the burst turret up a little bit. Ultimately, the patrol bot is not that annoying to take out. And the fact that, again, it can kind of replace itself if you get lucky does help it a lot. So that's where we're going to put that there. Next up, we have the Prospector drone. So this is a random encounter that might happen. You don't always get these every time you see a rival presence thing pop up. These are a random encounter that you might happen to find in pretty much any of the missions that you go through. And it is a boss enemy, and it is a relatively easy boss enemy to go through. You just have to damage it enough times to take out one of its health segments, then it goes immune. The biggest thing about this thing is it runs away a lot because it is not necessarily a combat bot. It is a drilling and prospecting bot. That being said, it does have combat capabilities. It can make shredders, it can make bots, it can make all that kind of stuff. And ultimately, the hardest thing about this thing is just keeping up with it, which if you have a scout or even a driller, it might not necessarily be that big of a deal, but the fact that the thing does like to run away from you, a little bit annoying. But ultimately, fighting this thing is not the hardest thing in the world. In fact, I would say it's relatively easy to take this thing out. I would say right around here where we're going to go. Then we have the Nemesis. So the Nemesis is another, obviously, rival tech enemy, and this is similar to the Prospector, a boss-like creature, although it does not have a boss health bar, similar to things like Dreadnoughts or anything like that. But that being said, I do still kind of label it as a boss-type enemy. It can be very oppressive and also intimidating, because what this thing does is it will imitate the sound of dwarves. So it will try to get you to go to it by saying things like, oh, I found something over here. Oh, come get me. Now, if you're smart, you'll know that it's a nemesis because you'll hear like the glitches and the static and stuff like that. The fact that it does that is kind of creepy. It has that creepiness factor, so it has that going for it. Ultimately, again, it's not that hard to take out. The only real thing about this thing is that it has the ability to grab you, similar to the Mactera Grabbers, similar to the Leeches. It has the ability to grab you. And I believe if no one gets you out of it or you don't break yourself out of it, I think it can just hold you there indefinitely. So if you're playing by yourself and you don't have like Bosco to take care of you or anything like that, or you don't have heightened senses, this thing might just straight up end your run instantly. So that's kind of a terrifying thing that it has. Outside of that, it's not really terrible. It has a good amount of attacks that it can do. And the biggest thing that it does is if you do kill it, if you do beat it, it does this like self-destruct mode where it just spawns a bunch of phase bombs around you and you have to run around and just avoid it, or else they'll take you out with it. But ultimately, outside of that, I'd say it's not really the worst thing in the world, especially since it doesn't show up very often. So I would say, no. I'd say it's a relative pain to go through. It's only because of the fact that like it can grab you, and that can be really, really annoying to take out. Then we have the Caretaker. So the Caretaker is the final boss sort of stage of industrial sabotage missions. It's kind of hard to really quantify this because this is part of a mission objective. But that being said, if I had to put it anywhere, I would say that it's... Now, I'm a little bit biased because I do love industrial sabotage missions and they are my favorite types of missions. So I would say that this fight, I will say it can be kind of a bit of an annoyance. Only because there are a lot of things that happen in the industrial sabotage missions that can cause you to get hurt. It spawns those arms that come after you. It can create sentry turrets. It can release shredders. It has its own set of attacks that it can do. It can launch phase bombs. There's a lot of things that you have to keep track of. Outside of that, though, the fact that this is only linked to a specific mission doesn't make it necessarily all that bad, because you know you're going to be fighting this thing when you go into an industrial sabotage mission, so you can prep yourself out accordingly for that. So the next three I'm going to actually lump together because they all are part of the same thing, which is the Corlock Tyrant Weed. And these are all parts of it. And honestly, these are all going to be going into the oh god no category. I am not a fan of fighting the Corlock Tyrant Weed for one real reason, and that is that because of the fact that the tendrils show up randomly. If the cave generation is not in your favor, which a lot of the times it's not, this thing can be a pain in the absolute butt to take out. And every time, it's always in a very inconvenient location. It's in a room that you're in an escort mission that Doretta is in that you just can't help but activate, or it's near, you know, a Dreadnought egg, so you have no choice but to kind of activate it. And it can just, at least in my experiences, it always is just an inconvenient thing to go up against. And the sprouts, the healing pods, all that kind of stuff, depending on how, like what hazard level you're on and how many players you have, it can just be a real pain to take out. And I hate going up against these things. So now we have reached the Rockpox enemies, and I'm sure a lot of people were really waiting for me to get to this particular section. And here we are. So first we're going to start off with the Rockpox Larva. The Rockpox Larva, I would say, is similar to the other swarming type enemies that we've come across, where it is quite an annoyance to deal with, which is ironic because they're very similar to the Carnivorous Larva, which you would think that would make them easy. And yes, they are easy to kill, essentially. They only take like one hit to take out, and they explode when they die and all that kind of stuff. But the only real problem is that these guys release Rockpox. every single one of them releases Rockpox when they die. And if you take out 2 or 3 or 4 of these things, it can fill up your entire Rockpox meter. And that is just the most annoying thing in the world. And I think going through all of the Rockpox enemies, I think they all suffer from the biggest issue of just constantly spreading Rockpox even when you don't want them to. Because the fact that you essentially can't fight these things in any way, shape, or form close quarters, which is tough because they're going to want to attack you because they fight in melee, so they're going to inevitably get close to you. The Rockpox enemies are just very oppressive by nature, but we'll try to do our best to go through each of them. And we're going to start with the Rockpox Grunt. So the Rockpox Grunt is very similar to a normal Grunt, and I would say that out of all the Rockpox enemies, it's probably the easiest to go with. So we'll honestly probably try to be a little bit nice, and I will put the Rockpox Grunt probably near its normal variant, just because of the fact that outside of popping its Rockpox boils, it is just a Grunt. It doesn't really do anything fancy. The Rockpox is definitely something that is holding this enemy back, but in terms of all the Rockpox enemies, this is one that is not really that bad. Next up on the list, however, is the Rockpox Praetorian, which is a little bit different and is a lot more oppressive, to say the least. The Praetorian is more dangerous than a normal Praetorian because instead of the normal spewing breath that it does, which does either frost or radiation or whatever it is, it just does Rockpox. So this thing can just give you Rockpox like it's nothing. It makes it for an absolute pain to go up against. So I'm probably going to put this in the low pain category. On the same vein, we have the Rockpox Exploder, which that honestly is also probably going to go directly into the pain category. The regular exploders are bad enough in the fact that they do damage. The fact that these guys also release Rockpox is so much worse because it just makes it so annoying to take out. And I hate the fact that I keep on getting Rockpox pretty much inherently from these guys just by taking them out, because everything releases Rockpox when they die, and these guys just happen to release it twice as much because when they explode, they also release it, and when they die, they also release it. So these things can just completely immobilize you just by themselves. And then we have the Rockpox Acid Spitter, and these make the normal Acid Spitter look like child's play because these things are just... Imagine all the range and all the firepower that the Spitters had normally, and then add the fact that they are applying Rockpox with every single hit. So not only are you going to basically just get immobilized in about 0.2 seconds, but then you're just going to die. These things just hit so hard. Again, they have such good range, such good accuracy, and the fact that they basically just immobilize you with Rockpox, and then you're just sort of sitting ducks and just waiting to die. If there's 2 of them, you are in a world of trouble, because the 2 of them are just going to combo you out and take you down. The Rockpox Acid Spitters are definitely one of the more oppressive ones out of all the Rockpox enemies. But that's not even talking about the next unit that we have, which is the Rockpox Goo-Bomber. Now, the Goo-Bomber, it's not as bad as I want to say it is. It's still incredibly annoying because of the simple fact that it is harder to take out than the normal Goo-Bomber because its weak points are not nearly as effectively reached. Instead of just having 2 very easily understandable weak points, now this thing has several weak points that are not the easiest thing in the world to hit because in some cases they are on top of the Goo-Bomber where you will not be able to hit it because it is above you. So taking this thing out can be a real pain in the butt. Honestly, because of that, yeah, we're probably still going to put it in the pain category, ultimately just because it's just so annoying to take out. So then we have the Rockpox Naedocyte Breeder, which compared to the last one is very different because the normal Naedocyte Breeder is usually not too, as I said, not too bad because it itself doesn't do anything. And while, yes, the Rockpox Naedocyte Breeder is in a similar situation where it itself doesn't necessarily do anything, the problem with it is the fact that it is creating something that is even more dangerous than Naedocyte Hatchlings, which is the Rockpox Larva. That is what it spawns out instead of the Naedocyte Hatchlings, which are, in my opinion, a lot more annoying to deal with. And again, the fact that you can only damage it really through its weak points, this thing is significantly more of an annoyance to take out. I still wouldn't say it's insanely difficult just because of the fact that, again, it itself doesn't do anything. But the fact that it creates Rockpox Larva in and of itself, in fact, I'm probably going to put that as well in the pain category. Rockpox in general is just very, very difficult to go up against because you essentially can't get too close to anything involving Rockpox or else you're just going to get immobilized and then you're just sitting ducks to die. Then we have the Lithophage Corruptor, the biggest and most powerful of the Rockpox enemies to date. It is the seasonal enemy that came out with Season 4. Oh man, there's a lot of things we could talk about this one. This thing is difficult to take out in a lot of different ways. I mentioned this all in a video that I made recently about issues with Season 4, which I'll link in the description if you guys want to see that. But essentially, this thing is very, very difficult to take out. And it is essentially because of the fact that it is for arbitrary and unnecessary reasons. The fact that this thing can only be damaged after you have cleansed out the armor, the way that the health damage works, the amount of Rockpox damage that this thing does to you. It can fill your Rockpox bar in an instant, and then it itself does so much damage. So that way, if you are not paying attention for even a second, this thing can take you out. And if you try to avoid it, because technically you can just ignore this thing because it can't aggro you unless you physically attack it with the Lithophage Foamer and Vacuum, then you have to deal with the amount of Rockpox that it leaves behind, which does more damage than normal Rockpox because it has its own attacks linked to it. In the beginning of Season 4, I was like, okay, cool. This is a cool fight. So this is probably where it would be at that time. But now I'm like, it's a real pain to go through. Do I still do it? Yes. Do I still like that I get rewards for it? Yes, absolutely. I do still like the idea of this as an enemy and as a unit and as a sort of event thing that you can do. I just think that it definitely needs to get tweaked. It definitely needs to get altered. It needs to get adjusted. And I think it just needs to get balanced to a much better degree. But that's just me. So then we have a couple of weird options. First up, we have the Xynarch Charge Sucker. Weird to say out loud. But basically, these are the little things that you find on the Betsy bots that are around. The Betsy is like infected with it. You have to cleanse it off, and then you can repair the Betsy, and it now fights for you. So I don't know why necessarily it labels this as the enemy when I would say Betsy is more close to the enemy. These are relatively, if we're going off of just the Charge Suckers itself, it's a really irrelevant enemy because it doesn't do anything. Betsy itself does something. So if I was rating this from Betsy, I would probably say it's a little bit more in the balanced category because Betsy has a good number of attacks, but they're not really too bad. They're easily telegraphed. You can avoid them, and there are strategies you can learn about them. But for the Charge Sucker itself, that they don't really do anything other than just sit there and take hits. And then we have the Deep Tora Bow Wasp Nest. These can appear on a couple of biomes. I don't remember off the top of my head. These are basically just the wasp nests that appear randomly. They can spawn bugs if you get close to them. These are relatively easy to go through. Just don't stand near them and just take them out from a distance, and you can take them out relatively easily. And it's not really that hard. And then lastly, we have the Deep Tora Honeycomb, which, similar to the last one, it basically just houses bees and they do damage, and it's essentially the exact same thing. If you don't get close to it and you just take it out from a distance, it's a relatively easy thing to take out. And that is my tier listings of all of the enemy types in Deep Rock Galactic at this time. I thank every single one of you for sticking by this long. I'm sure this was a very, very long one, and I'm sure that a lot of people are going to have a lot of things to say, and that is perfectly fine. Again, this is all based off of my experiences, off of my play styles, and all these types of things, and I'm sure everybody has different ways that they feel about A, B, and C enemy. I feel like there's a couple of things that people will most likely agree with me with, which is things like the Corruptor, the Stingtail, the Rockpox enemies in general. Things like the Caretaker, I'm sure people are probably going to disagree with me on, but again, I love industrial sabotage missions, so that's why I like them so much. Same thing with like the Warden and stuff, but let me know what you guys think down in the comments. I had a lot of fun doing this. This is probably the tier list that has taken me the most time and effort to put together and try to figure out how I'm going to do this, but it's also one that I had a lot of fun doing. Ultimately, as I say with most of these tier lists, my opinion on these will probably change throughout the course of the year, the month, the week, so who knows? Maybe in a years from now or a couple months from now, maybe I'll do this again to sort of update myself. Maybe when Season 5 comes out, and if they add new enemies there, I'll probably do a whole nother thing. You never know what's going to happen with that. But I just want to say thank you guys for sticking through this whole video. I know there was a lot to go through, and hopefully you guys are not too angry with me. And I hope this was fun. I'll also put a link to the playlist that I have of other tier lists that I've done, so you can see all the kind of stuff I've done with that. And if you found this video entertaining, please hit the like button and be sure to subscribe, because it tells me what types of videos you guys want to see. Thank you guys so much for sitting through this, and I will see you in the next video.